So here you have this problem. In the Middle East, on February 25th, one or more people went into a holy shrine of the Jewish people, which was also a holy shrine of the Muslims, and systematically assassinated as many people as possible with automatic weapons fire while they were praying. That's what just happened. Hundreds of people were shot. How many died, I don't recall, but hundreds were shot. The killers in this atrocity were, of course, trying to break up the peace accords and destabilize the region. They were trying to rescue a certain type of British approach to things and subvert an alternative approach that could be of great value to the world. Now, what we need to do is to understand who did that and what are they. If I say that this is the British doing that, you have to understand what that means. That's not just, I mean, it's not some sort of indirect thing that we're talking about here. It's not a slander or just a characterization. In a sense, this is similar to, we published a book called Dope Incorporated. And that book took up the question of whatever happened. We're trying to understand the dope problem in America when we wrote that book, when EIR did that book. And so we studied the question, whatever happened to the old British Empire opium trade of the 19th century, when they openly went over and made wars to force countries like China to have opium? Whatever happened to those forms of business, to the shipping companies that did that and so forth? How did they leave that business and get into some other type, more legitimate business? And the answer was pretty shocking. The answer was they never did leave it, and they're still doing it. They just changed certain formats. They set up banks in different parts of the world over, but they still continued to do exactly the same business. Certain new areas were opened up, cocaine and so forth. The same thing applies in this area, that you have a long-standing British involvement in the Middle East, which people know something about, and I'm going to get into that tonight, which never stopped. Even though the British Empire doesn't seem to be a big deal in the world, right? What's the British Empire, after all? It's nothing, right? Went out of existence, more or less. Now, really, what's the International Monetary Fund? What are international bankers? What is the international media? I'm going to make a simple proposition on the killers at Hebron. There are two ways that you have to understand them. Number one, they are representatives of a British party. It's essentially British. And number two, they're gangsters. Now, by gangsters, I mean people who run dope, gun running, prostitution, robberies, murder, etc. And there's a political organization of this party within the Jewish community that includes people in very fancy suits. They go by the name of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. And then there's people who wear the clothing of an FBI provocateur like Meyer, who organized terrorist parties in Brooklyn, and they're still sending guns and people over to Israel to blow the place up. But this is a single party. Now, this is of immense importance to us in many different ways. I'm going to write a word on the board here. There's a company called the Hollinger Corporation, which is a sort of board of directors, in a certain sense, for this party that I'm talking about. The Hollinger Corporation is a newspaper publishing company that owns many different newspapers and probably other types of media, but it's the newspapers that we're primarily concerned about here. This company owns the Jerusalem Post, which is the main English language newspaper of Israel. And that in Israel, the Jerusalem Post is the mouthpiece for the violent, terrorist, anti-Arab faction. Ariel Sharon, the former general, the enormously fat general. He speaks through the Jerusalem Post. It didn't used to be like that. It was more of a liberal media. Now they call it right-wing. But you're missing the point a little bit unless you see the Hollinger Corporation owns it. They also own the Telegraph in London, the Daily Telegraph. They also own the Chicago Sun-Times. They also own the Financial Post of Canada, like the Wall Street Journal of Canada. And they own about 80 other newspapers in the United States. This is actually a British and Canadian company. Now here's the board of some of the people on the board of directors. Peter Bronfman, who owns the real estate, who manages the real estate operations for the Bronfman family of Canada. Margaret Thatcher, Lord Carrington, and his partner, Henry Kissinger, from Kissinger Associates. David Brinkley, Lord Rothschild, William F. Buckley Jr., whose brother turned down our appeal, and so we have to go to, he's a judge in Washington. Paul Volcker, and Lord Wiedenfeld, who is the head of the Institute for Jewish Affairs in London, which is an anti-defamation league front operation over there. The London Daily Telegraph is the original source, and this corporation is the original source of the Whitewater affair. That is, these people from England and their representatives in Washington began to publish violent attacks on President Clinton at a certain point when he began to question certain British Empire approaches to things, particularly what was going on in Russia. He said maybe it's not so great that the IMF is saying that Russia should be stripped bare and people should starve and they should deliver all their worldly goods up to international financiers and gangsters. Maybe that won't work. He just questioned it a little bit. And remember, the chronology is very important, because what Clinton did around the same time as he and Gore both questioned this international liberal establishment program. Pretty wild, right, for Gore to question that? The world is interesting today, right? But it's Clinton first made that question. So he appointed Bobby Inman to be Secretary of Defense, who also questions some of these things, and Strobe Talbot to be Deputy Secretary of State. And Strobe Talbot had said, just before that, he was a special ambassador to Russia. He had said, maybe we need a little bit less shock and a little more therapy. Now they were talking about the so-called shock therapy that this crowd has been hitting Russia with. And if you keep backing Russia into a corner by saying you should be poor and starve, that welcome to capitalism, all you're going to do is turn them into an enemy, and they've got H-bombs. You want a World War III? That's a good way to get it. Maybe that's not a good plan. He said maybe that's not a good plan. So all of a sudden, both Strobe Talbot and Bobby Inman were accused of what? Being anti-Israel. Didn't have anything to do with what they were talking about. It's not true either. But you get a sense, you begin to get a sense of the party that we're talking about. Now, when I say that we're talking about gangsters, this is not just using that word in some loose fashion. We're talking about, for example, Meyer Lansky. Who is Meyer Lansky? He's dead now, but who was he? He was considered the kingpin of he was the lead financier and organizer for organized crime in the United States. He was born in Poland, and there's a book out. In fact, I have this book right here. Did I bring it with me? There it is, around the floor. Here. Meyer Lansky. It's written by 3 Israelis. One of them is Yuri Dan. These people, the authors are Israeli journalists who are spokesmen for this party. They're mouthpieces for Ariel Sharon and the violent, extreme, racist, anti-Arab faction in Israel. And what they say in this book, which is entirely favorable to Meyer Lansky, is that Lansky heard from his parents in Poland about anti-Jewish attacks that were going on all the time and learned that Jews should fight back against these attacks. So that therefore, because of these attacks, whatever somebody like Lansky does is really morally justified. And obviously they're using this to relate to what they're doing, but that's not the only thing. Because you begin to find out that they are closely related to Meyer Lansky in their activities. And you see little incidents. If you don't know anything more than is in this book, you might not quite figure it out. But, for example, when Ariel Sharon invaded Egypt in the 1967 war, Meyer Lansky's organization sent him a basket of champagne and cigars in Egypt. Meyer Lansky's organization. And that's in the book. What's that all about? Isn't that weird? A general in a war? And he was criticized for doing that, too. He had champagne and caviar and cigars from the Meyer Lansky organization in the middle of his war. Now, how is that related to what we have to deal with in politics? Well, it goes back, again, to this problem that you have, that the most important things that you have to discuss with people are things that they don't even think are relevant to anything. Give you an example. Any of you go to the movies, ever? Any of you ever watch television? If you consider the fact that Hollywood was set up and has been run by killers, by satanic killers, that is, people who murder again and again and again and again. They also set up Las Vegas as a coordinated operation. That after World War II, the British Special Operations Executive, that is the secret intelligence service of the British operating out of Canada and England, set up operations for the Lansky mob to launder drug money, to run things in the Caribbean, and to run gambling operations all over the country. And these people directly set up Las Vegas completely. They set up all the lottery operations in the country. Now this is taken on a professional look to it, with professional corporations involved, supposedly not related to these people. But this is the future of the United States. We're going to be doing nothing but gambling and entertainment. You have gambling, entertainment, sex, perversion, and sports. 25 hours a day and no other industry. You don't have to do any other industry. The schools will train people to be workers in those industries, right? If this party predominates. The bootlegging, right? The gangsters, the American organized crime is entirely British. In the 1920s, under Prohibition, you have 3 principal figures setting that up on this end. One of them is Meyer Lansky, who's running operations with his underling, Lucky Luciano, and Al Capone and various people in different parts of the country, especially as you got towards about 1930, completely dominating that. Then you have the Bronfman family in Canada, and a guy named Arnold Rothstein, who's in high society and goes over to England, and all of those parts of it coordinate with the lords of England. Like General Haig, the head British general in World War I. His family runs Haig Scotch, and he's a partner with Bronfman. A direct partner, not a hidden partner. They are a company, 50-50, right? And the gangsters ran all of this under the complete control of Great Britain. Murder, hijacking, arson, constant murders. The amount of murders that were involved in setting up these different things. First, the so-called, bootlegging. But then you get into the post-bootlegging operations, these same channels of dope, smuggling, and gambling, and entertainment. All by the same group. And imagine if you say, let's legalize narcotics, that'll solve the problem. Well, how much are you going to legalize? You're going to legalize murder, legalize every element of this whole thing. That's not the solution to it. Now, where does this come from? What's the background of this arrangement?